Today we'll cover determining the lowest floor of a structure for National Flood Insurance Program compliance. We'll talk about what the lowest floor of a building is, why it matters, and how local officials responsible for managing floodplain development can check the data provided in permit forms and files they receive. Local NFIP participating communities agree to adopt and enforce ordinances and regulations that meet or exceed federal requirements to reduce the risk of flooding, protecting people and property. These adopted rules apply to all development in the special flood hazard areas identified on regulatory maps. In particular, structural development has certain elevation rules that apply for protection against flooding. Flood zones are geographic areas that FEMA has defined according to varying levels of flood risk. Special Flood Hazard Areas, or SFHAs, are mapped on a community's flood insurance rate maps, or FIRMs, and begin with the letters A or V, although Kansas has no coastal V zones. And they represent the area subject to the 1% annual chance flood. This regulatory floodplain may be shown with base flood elevations, or BFEs, and a regulatory floodway, depending on the level of risk analysis conducted. Or it may not display any elevation information. Areas outside the SFHA are marked as Flood Zone X. The elevation information from the maps and flood studies connects to the development requirements in local ordinances. In Kansas, new structures and existing structures that are substantially improved must have their lowest floor at least to the base flood elevation plus 1 foot. That means as the floodplain administrator, you need to know how to determine the minimum height for compliance at a given site and a BFE, how to look at building plans and visit a construction site and determine a building's lowest floor for NFIP compliance, as well as understand how building elevations are recorded on the FEMA Elevation Certificate or EC form, and how to review that data for compliance. So, what is the lowest floor and why does it matter? You'll need to know how to interpret which floor is the lowest floor, because it's not necessarily a direct measurement. The lowest floor may be the same as the bottom floor, or it may be a different floor. The NFIP defines the lowest floor as the lowest enclosed area of the lowest floor. An unfinished or flood-resistant enclosure used solely for parking of vehicles, building access, or storage in an area other than a basement area is not considered a building's lowest floor, provided that the enclosure is fully compliant with other NFIP requirements for enclosures. This means that there are conditions in your community's rules as to when a building's bottom floor would not necessarily be the lowest floor for floodplain management compliance. Review building plans closely and conduct inspections to verify the building's lowest floor elevation complies with the NFIP and your locally adopted floodplain management rules. You'll need to compare the difference between the building's floors and the base flood elevation to determine this compliance. To help you connect information about a building to the BFE and the lowest floor rule sets, we'll start by talking about building foundations and characteristics. We'll talk about elevation certificate forms and show comparisons and scenarios about the building's lowest floor. So here are some examples of typical building foundation types and their characteristics. There are different ways a building in the floodplain might be built. In these photo examples, building diagram numbers from an elevation certificate are provided. Buildings in the floodplain might be built on elevated slab foundations, raised up high enough to be above the BFE plus 1 foot. The building might be a split-level building where the various floors have offset heights. All the floors may be at or above ground level, or there might be a floor that's below ground level on all sides, which makes it a basement. In coastal areas, buildings may also be elevated on piers, posts, or piles instead of solid walls. They may or may not have enclosed areas underneath those piers and posts. While this is less commonly seen inland, it is possible to have manufactured homes, for example, elevated on short piers or posts, making them a diagram 5. Buildings may be built on a walkout level with a full-story enclosure, or buildings in the floodplain may be elevated on a short, non-full-story crawlspace foundation, such as this diagram 8 building. FEMA defines a basement as any area that's fully below grade on all sides. Fully below grade areas, or basements, are typically not allowed in the regulatory floodplain, so beware of building diagrams 2 and 4. Buildings of any of these foundation types I just reviewed may or may not have an attached garage. The presence of a garage does not change the foundation type of a building, but it might change the building's lowest floor. The garage may be the same floor height or might be a slightly different floor height, as seen here. Next, we'll connect these buildings to the basics of the FEMA Elevation Certificate form, focusing on the lowest floor. The Elevation Certificate form, or EC form, is designed specifically to collect the elevation and BFE data that you as the floodplain administrator needs in order to assess buildings' compliance. Information on the form can also be used to support letters of map change. And if your community is participating in the Community Rating System, or CRS program, use of this EC form is required to collect this elevation data. Use of the EC form is not required in order to obtain a flood insurance policy. However, the elevation certificate is designed to collect that information and can be used to support NFIP flood insurance rating. The current version of the form is available at FEMA's website. Detailed trainings about the elevation certificate form section by section are available elsewhere. But to summarize here, there are several sections to the EC form. Property information is collected in Section A. Anyone can fill out this section of the form. This tells you where is the building, what type of building is it, how is it built, is there an enclosure or attached garage, what is the use of the building, and if there's a crawl space or attached garage, are there flood openings? Section B is for flood insurance rate map or flood insurance study information. Anyone can fill this section of the form out as well. If you're the community, a best practice you can implement is filling in portions of B and A for your applicants so that you know that you have the correct BFE and building diagram number, for example. Here, you'll collect information about the flood insurance rate map panel number, flood zone or zones of the site, base flood elevation or depth, as well as where that information comes from, the flood insurance study, the flood insurance rate map, community determined source, or other sources like the Kansas BFE viewer for Zone A. Subsequent sections of the form deal with elevations about a building. In flood zones where the BFE is established, surveyed building elevations are required. Those are entered in Section C and verified by the registered professional in Section D. In flood zones where BFE is not established, building measurement information relative to grade or ground level is collected in Section E and certified in Section F. No special license is needed to collect information in Sections E and F, but a licensed professional surveyor is required for Section C, and they would sign and stamp that in Section D. Most of the scenarios we'll use today talk about information in Section C of the form and how to relate that to information in Sections B and A of the form. Section G of the form is a recommended section for use by the community official. It can help connect the elevation certificate information to other community permit data information, like permit date, permit number, whether it was issued for new construction or substantial improvement, and similar factors. It can also be used to capture freeboard elevation requirements. If the BFE is captured in Section B9, then any feet of freeboard your community has can be added to that BFE number and put here in Section G10. Sections H and I of the form are new and for flood insurance purposes only. They're not for use by the floodplain manager. They do not collect enough information for you to determine the building's lowest floor. And if we take a close-up of Section C, you'll notice that the lowest floor is actually not a field anywhere on the elevation certificate. It's not directly identified on the EC form, so it's not directly measured by the surveyor. You as the floodplain administrator must interpret which floor it is. The surveyor will take objective measurements of the bottom floor, any next higher floor, an attached garage if there is one, the lowest elevation of machinery, for example, as well as the adjacent grades to the building. You'll need to take the information from permit files, as well as the information the surveyor gives you about that bottom floor, any next higher floor, any garage, as well as utilities servicing the building, and compare them to the BFE or BFE plus 1 requirements to determine whether the building is compliant with your regulations. You'll need to keep that lowest floor definition in mind. It's the building's least high area enclosed by walls, unless that floor is an unfinished or flood-resistant enclosure that meets those limitations on use and rules about flood openings. That means you'll be cross-checking information found in multiple sections of the elevation certificate form. You'll need the building diagram information from Section A, flood zone and BFE in Section B, as well as information about the building's bottom and next higher floors, machinery, any enclosures present, as well as finishings, use, flood openings, and adjacent grades. Photos are also very useful. The photos shown at the beginning of this presentation were examples of different construction types. These are called building diagrams on the elevation certificate form, and there are 11 different building diagram types. The EC form instructions show each of these, as well as descriptions of the distinguishing features. There are both elevated and non-elevated types. The bottom floor, measured typically in Section C of the elevation certificate, is objectively measured by the surveyor. It simply is what it is. It's the least high point of the standing surface of the least high floor of a building that's enclosed by walls. The lowest floor, however, varies by building diagram, among other factors. While the bottom floor is always the one with the lowest elevation and does not change, the building's bottom floor is not necessarily also the lowest floor. In a slab or raised slab building, the lowest floor typically is also the bottom floor. There's no enclosed area that meets the other lowest floor definition rules. So C2A, the bottom floor, is also the lowest floor. In an elevated building, for example, this building elevated on a crawl space, the lowest floor might be that bottom enclosure floor, or it may be the next higher elevated finish floor, C2B. It depends on what's happening with the crawl space. If there's a basement present, as in this one on the right, that floor is automatically also the lowest floor. A basement is any area below grade on all sides, whether or not it's a full story below grade. These photos can help illustrate this elevated versus non-elevated building comparison. We'll see the raised slab building on the far left. That bottom floor is also the lowest floor. Enclosures, like the image in the middle, require flood openings if that floor below the BFE plus freeboard, in order for that floor not to be both the bottom floor and the lowest floor. If it meets all the enclosure requirements, the next higher floor becomes the lowest floor for compliance. Again, if a basement is present, that floor is automatically the lowest floor. If it's in the special flood hazard area, it will also always be below BFE. Attached garages have certain characteristics. They're enclosures that extend laterally from the building. They may or may not have living space above them. They may or may not be the same elevation as the main floor of the house, and they're typically unfinished and used as parking areas or for limited storage. They're not used as living space like the remainder of the house is. An attached garage with a floor elevation below the BFE can be excluded as the building's lowest floor if it fully meets that NFIP definition of an unfinished or flood-resistant enclosure that's usable solely for parking of vehicles, building access, or limited storage in an area that's not a basement, not fully below grade, and has proper flood openings. The same thing would apply to enclosures below the base flood elevation. They can be excluded from being the lowest floor if they're below BFE, if they're unfinished, have proper flood openings, are used only for parking, building access, or limited storage, and are not in a basement area. That means they're at or above exterior grade on at least one side to prevent them from being a basement. And proper flood openings, remember, means at least 2 flood openings that provide at least 1 square inch of open area for each square foot of enclosed area. The flood openings have to be within 1 foot of grade. It's still the bottom floor, but then the next higher floor is the lowest floor for compliance purposes. Let's look at an example. If this is a raised slab on grade building with an attached garage and no second floor. Then the bottom floor, or the main finished floor of the building, would be collected in C2A. There is no next higher floor, and we don't need a lowest horizontal structural member. The attached garage information goes in C2D of the form, as well as elevation of machinery and equipment, and the lowest adjacent grade and highest adjacent grade. To determine if this is compliant, we also need BFE information, as well as to determine if there are flood openings in this attached garage. Let's say the base flood elevation is 581.1 feet. That means the top of the bottom floor is sufficiently elevated, but the attached garage would be below BFE. That would be allowable if the enclosed area or garage meets those requirements, including limitations on use of flood damage resistant materials, and installation of sufficient flood openings. If all of those requirements are not met, then the garage is the lowest floor. Next, let's cover some permit review and inspections tips to help you ensure a building's compliance with NFIP rules. Collecting the proposed development details, including the flood zone, the base flood elevation, the type of building, its heights, and other elements, can help you capture enough detail to tell the applicant what elevation information is needed. As a tip, you can actually preload that flood insurance rate map information into Section B of the elevation certificate form. Review construction plan sets to make sure a building is designed and elevated appropriately. Look at the kind of foundation, check all the floors, and compare them to the base flood elevation or your design flood elevation of BFE plus 1 foot. If the bottom floor is below that elevation, then check that it has everything it needs to have in terms of flood openings, being unfinished space, and meeting those limited uses. That's why it's important to make sure that utilities are also identified on plans. Their location and elevation information might impact what a building's lowest floor is. When requiring elevation certificates as part of the permitting process, don't just simply accept and file one because a surveyor stamped it and gave it to you. You should always review ECs for accuracy and completeness. You want to check that the information supports your community's official determination of compliance. If the form is incomplete or incorrect, send the elevation certificate back to the developer, surveyor, or property owner to fix and resubmit the form. The state of Kansas has an EC checklist available on their Floodplain Management Resources website to support you in this important role. There are multiple points at which a building inspector may visit a construction site. Collecting elevation when the floors are established is an important during construction inspection point. This typically happens at foundation or framing, or the point at which a building's finished floor is established. Ideally, you can verify the building's lowest floor at this point prior to vertical wall construction, so that if the floor is too low relative to BFE, it's faster and cheaper to correct at that point versus waiting until later when more work must be undone. Requiring a during construction elevation certificate to be submitted while the building is under construction and you have the building floor information helps you collect the right standardized data along with the BFE to verify this compliance while a building is being constructed. Other things you'll want to check in addition to if the building is properly elevated is especially if there are enclosure floors and they are going to be below the base flood elevation, do they meet all the appropriate requirements? Are they not a basement? Are there sufficient openings planned for the flood openings? Things like that. Here's an example during construction inspection scenario where the building's garage floor is set up to be slightly lower than the finished first floor, which is fairly common with some construction. How can you and the inspector determine which one is the lowest floor? If this building is in the special flood hazard area, remember that both the finished floor and the garage floor also matter. If either is going to be below that BFE plus 1, they'll need to meet those enclosure rules. Unfinished or flood-resistant materials space, proper flood openings, and limitations on use, storage, parking, access. Have a construction inspection checklist that helps you keep an eye out for these items. Would you expect to see this kind of a building in the special flood hazard area during construction? Why or why not? We can see from this full-size window well that there's likely a basement down here. In basements, are defined by the NFIP as any area of the building that's below grade on all sides. It doesn't have to be fully below or a full story below grade, but any area of the building below grade on all sides is typically not allowed in the special flood hazard area as new construction or substantial improvement. This substantial improvement piece means that existing buildings, if they suffer substantial damage or are substantially improved, and they have basements, they may need to mitigate their buildings to remove or reduce these below-grade areas, since basements are typically not allowed. For example, if this basement living room existed in a house in the floodplain that was built before the first flood map was published, it would have been built in compliance, but because it's now in the floodplain, you'll need to monitor for if that building becomes substantially improved or substantially damaged, because SISD buildings must be treated as new construction. That means future changes to this building may change its compliance. I mentioned the basement is any area below grade and that it doesn't have to be a full story below grade. In some areas of the country, below grade crawl space enclosures are a common construction type. This can be allowed, but only if the local ordinance or regulations specifically contains language allowing below grade crawl spaces. These are Elevation Certificate Building Diagram 9s. FEMA Technical Bulletin 11 outlines the specifications for permitting below grade enclosures. They may be no more than 2 feet below the lowest adjacent grade, no more than 4 feet from the crawl space floor to the underside of the floor joist, and they must have proper flood openings, at least 1 square inch of flood opening per 1 square foot of enclosure. If these conditions are not outlined in the ordinance or regulations and are not met by a building, that becomes a non-compliant basement. The state's new floodplain permit template helps to cue you if a building is new construction or a change to an existing building. When reviewing permits for changes to existing buildings, it's important to calculate if the work is substantial improvement or substantial damage. Does the cost of the work equal or exceed 50% of the structure's market value prior to the improvement or damage? Why do we care about that? Because it can change the requirements for the building's lowest floor. If the structure is in the special flood hazard area and there's work proposed to change the existing structure, you must collect the full cost of improvement or repairs to the building and divide that by the structure's market value. If the ratio is equal to or greater than 50%, that substantial improvement or repair of substantial damage must meet your community's standards for new construction, and that includes elevation of the lowest floor to BFE plus 1 foot. Administration of the SI and SD requirements is an important local role of the floodplain administrator. The solution for a given existing building will depend on several factors such as flood zone, the type of foundation, how feasible it is to elevate or mitigate, and whether the building is residential or non-residential, where flood proofing might be an option. FEMA has useful publications about the important SISD requirements, as well as solutions for mitigation. There are different options for homeowners that apply both to newly built homes as well as existing homes located in flood-prone areas. Mitigation measures may include elevating a home above that BFE plus 1, relocating a home to higher ground outside of a flood risk area. However, oftentimes it may not be feasible to elevate residential structures, and FEMA Publication 1037 focuses on mitigation measures and retrofits other than elevating a home, such as basement infill, shown here, where abandoning the lowest floor, or elevating interior floors, or wet floodproofing using flood openings are options. Next, let's cover some example scenarios. What's the lowest floor for this building? Is it the bottom floor where the car is parked, the next higher floor, or something different? Recall the definition of a building's lowest floor. It's the least high area enclosed by walls, unless that floor below BFE is not a basement, has limited uses, and is properly designed or vented. Which floor do you think is the lowest floor here? It'll be this one. The parking area shown on the bottom floor is in a full-story unfinished enclosure directly beneath an elevated building. If it's used only for parking, storage, and building access, is unfinished, and has proper flood vents and uses flood-resistant materials, it remains the bottom floor, but is not the lowest floor for floodplain management purposes. Let's walk through this example scenario using information from the elevation certificate. As we mentioned earlier, you'll need information from Section C of the form, where building elevations are collected, as well as information from Section B of the form, where the BFE information is found. Section C2 collects the bottom floor, the next higher floor if there is one, attached garages, equipment, and adjacent grades. The bottom floor is an objective measurement. The area of this building where the car is parked remains the bottom floor. But because it's properly vented and has those limitations on use, the next higher floor becomes the lowest floor for floodplain management purposes. This building does not have an attached garage because the garage area is an enclosure beneath the elevated building. We also know that the parking area is not the lowest floor because it's not a basement. You can see that the top of the bottom floor is higher than the lowest adjacent grade. In order to check that there are sufficient flood vents in this parking area, we'll need information from Section A of the form. The important number to keep in mind is that 1-to-1 ratio. You need at least 1 square inch of flood opening, A8D in this case, per square foot of enclosed area. That means you need the number in A8D to be as big or bigger than the number in A8A. Let's try a slightly different example scenario. Does this building have a compliant lowest floor? Yes or no? This building is elevated on a crawl space foundation, called a building diagram 8. In this case, it also has an attached garage, which does not change the building diagram number, but may influence the lowest floor. The crawl space floor is the bottom floor recorded on the elevation certificate. This enclosure is not considered the building's lowest floor if it has proper flood vents and is unfinished space. C2D, the floor of the garage, is its own line on the elevation certificate. This floor is below BFE plus 1, is used only for parking and storage, however, it's not properly vented. So in that case, it is the building's lowest floor. This results in a non-compliant building because the lowest floor is below BFE plus 1. A fix in this case would be to mitigate the attached garage by including sufficient flood vents. Here's a building on a crawl space without an attached garage, where it looks like the finished floor is above the BFE. What's the lowest floor here? And is it okay? Here's the lowest floor. However, it is a violation. Can you see why? It's because of the state's BFE plus 1 requirement. This would be a scenario where a crawl space is properly vented, making the finished floor the lowest floor. However, the structure is in violation of the freeboard requirement because it was above BFE, but not above BFE plus 1 foot. A mid-construction inspection should have caught that the building's finished floor was still below the base flood elevation recorded in B9 plus 1 foot. Using Section G to record that BFE plus 1 requirement can help you as the floodplain administrator catch these buildings before they reach finished construction. Here's a building with a full-story basement. Does this impact the lowest floor? If you remember from the definition, a basement is any area of the building below grade on all sides, and a basement is automatically a building's lowest floor. Basement buildings, those diagrams 2A, 2B, and 4, are typically not allowed as new construction or for existing structures that are substantially improved or substantially damaged. You can see that that building's floor is below grade on all sides, is automatically the lowest floor, and is well below the BFE plus 1 requirement. If you have older homes with basements in your regulatory floodplain, you'll need to watch out for these and the SISD thresholds. It's also important to keep in mind the potential differentiation between a basement and a subgrade crawlspace. While the NFIP defines a basement as any area below grade on all sides, there is an allowance for building diagram 9s, which are subgrade crawlspaces that meet a certain set of requirements. How would that impact the building's lowest floor here? There are a few possible issues here. If the crawlspace floor does not have sufficient flood vents, that crawlspace floor is the lowest floor for floodplain management purposes. Remember, there must be at least 2 flood openings with a ratio of 1 square inch of opening to 1 square foot of enclosure. So an easy fix here could be to add flood vents to the crawlspace, bringing the next higher floor to the lowest floor. It also could be that the bottom of the flood vents may be too high. Remember, flood vents must be within 1 foot of grade, either the interior or the exterior grade. Finally, for that subgrade crawlspace, or building diagram 9, a community must have language in their ordinance or resolution that specifically allows these diagram 9 buildings in order to avoid them being violations. They must meet the information in Technical Bulletin 11 that says that subgrade crawlspace must be no more than 5 feet between the bottom floor of the crawlspace and the next higher floor. The crawlspace floor must also be no more than 2 feet below the lowest adjacent grade, no more than 2 feet deep, and no more than 5 feet between the crawlspace floor and the next higher floor. Any deeper than that, or any taller than that, and you have a basement building. Diagram 2A or 2B. That means you'll need to pay close attention to any proposed subgrade crawlspace buildings to make sure that they stay within the parameters outlined in your ordinance or resolution. We hope this presentation was a useful overview of how to understand what a building's lowest floor is for floodplain management compliance, and showing you that the lowest floor depends on multiple factors, so it's important to review permits and plans closely. Collect and review the information on elevation certificates to determine whether the building's lowest floor is the bottom floor, the next higher floor, the attached garage, or something different. The bottom floor, the next higher floor, or the attached garage. Checking those floor elevations at on-site inspections during construction can help you avoid a potential violation reaching finished construction stage. As always, it's important to maintain relevant permit records for sound floodplain management purposes. And finally, here are a few resources we hope are useful for you. The Kansas Current Effective Floodplain Viewer is a useful online tool for finding the base flood elevation and the flood zone. You can use this to preload flood insurance rate map information, such as flood zone and BFE, into Section B of an elevation certificate. You can print a map, give it to the applicant, and keep it with your permit file. Some regulatory floodplain areas in the state are designated as Zone A, where FEMA has mapped the 1% annual chance flood, but does not publish a base flood elevation or BFE. Base level engineering data in these cases can provide additional model-based data for local communities with these zones to use to regulate development activity and ensure it's reasonably safe from flooding. Kansas has a BFE portal, which allows users to request approximate BFE data. You can create an account and then select a structure boundary to make a request for BFE data at this website. The Residential Low Floor Violations handout was one fact sheet developed in 2024 to help local officials clarify the definition of the lowest floor and deal with potential violations. Find this and other resources on the Kansas Department of Agriculture, Division of Water Resources Floodplain Management page. Additionally, FEMA has several technical bulletins and publications like these, which are useful references for local floodplain administrators. Thank you.